I've just been thinking about terrorism, and specifically poetic terrorism. And let's have a think about that for a bit, I think. When I'm talking about poetic terrorism, I should just put a qualification on there. What I'm not talking about is any kind of trivialization of acts of terror, or anything, akin to those kind of stupid remarks that were made after 9/11 by whoever it was, some composer who said it was a great work of art. That nothing to do with that all bullshit. The term poetic terrorism, I think, comes from Hakim Bey, but it might have been somebody else. I'll have a look when I get home anyway. And it refers to a specific kind of activity, particularly activist activity. Activist behaviours, acts of kind of political transformation that work in the way that terrorism works. That's the idea of it. They don't kill people, they don't damage property, they don't harm anybody necessarily, usually. But they work according to the same theoretical principles that terrorism works, or at least some of them. So if I'm going to talk about poetic terrorism, I have to talk about terrorism, and that may take longer than I've got, but never mind, I'll give it a go. There's a whole range of reasons why people carry out acts of terrorism, or if you're on their side, act as freedom fighters. But one of the ones that's most influential, I can't remember the name of the guy who came up with this, but the idea is that you commit acts of terror, bombings, that kind of thing, not because it's a kind of strategic military operation, because you try to take out, I don't know, centres of government or knock down communication lines. It's not a military action, it's a different kind of action, and it's an action which is designed to provoke a response, and the response in turn is one which makes visible structures of power which were not visible before. That's the idea. Just to clarify that, I better give a couple of examples. The most telling example for me is the actions of the IRA during the 1970s. And again, whether you feel they were terrorists or freedom fighters is kind of a moot point. But certainly some of their actions were followed kind of classical terrorism theory in that regard. Particularly once they started taking on soft targets, civilian targets. And the one that sticks most brightly in my mind was the bombing of the Arndale Centre in Manchester. And the reason why I sticks is because my mum was in the Arndale Centre at the time and was caught up in all that, and it was a very lively time for us all. But but the IRA, for years, in their political guise as Sinn Féin, for years prior to the start of the Troubles, have been protesting and complaining and campaigning about the fact that they felt that Northern Ireland was a colony, basically, subject to the rule and the power structures of an occupying colonial power, the English. That's what they felt. Now we can dispute whether they felt correct about that or not, but that's what they felt. That was their position, that they were the colonial subjects of an occupying foreign power. And as I say, they campaigned about that a lot, and tried to drum up support and tried to make people see that's what was happening there. And basically people didn't get it. A lot of people just didn't get it. Because they got up in the morning, they went to work, they came home, they had their dinner, they took the dog for a walk, they went to the pub, had a couple of pints, went home, went to bed. Life went on. You got up, you went to the shop, you did your shopping, you came home, made the lunch, everything was fine. So it didn't feel like there was anything to complain about. And then they started the terror. I don't think it was quite as mechanistic as I'm making it sound, but they started the bombing campaigns and the shooting campaigns. Bombing border posts and guard posts, police stations, sniper attacks on police, and then they started taking on softer targets, pubs, that kind of thing, nightclubs, shootings of civilians, and then eventually that moved to the British mainland, and there were several bombings. Obviously the one in Manchester I just mentioned. There was a McDonald's in Warrington, quite near Manchester, that was taken out. And people were getting killed, and that was when people started to sit up and take notice. But the way it worked after that is, of course, as soon as those things happened, the British government, who for the IRA's perspective was the occupying power, took action. Basically, within a week of the first few bombings, there was British troops on the streets of Belfast. There was checkpoints, identity checks, They're, so, and a whole range of measures, security measures put into place to try to prevent the increase of terrorism, those bombings and so on, which is exactly what was wanted. Because suddenly it wasn't that life went on as usual. You got up in the morning, and if you wanted to go to work, you had to set off half an hour early because you knew you had to drive through 3 checkpoints and have your passport checked. And if you wanted to go shopping again, you would have to walk past heavily armed and padded soldiers as you went out there. And my brother served in Northern Ireland for a while when he was in the military, so I have kind of first-hand experience of that. And and the whole sort of cycle of intimidation which revolves around that. And as that continued, what was brought in then was internment without trial in the maze, in H blocks, and subsequently human rights abuses in some of those places. So, what was invisible before, the whole invisible power structure of this, occupying foreign government, with all of its apparatus of state power, like military and identity checks and all that, suddenly became very, very visible indeed. And a lot of people became radicalised one way or the other as a result of that. And there was just years of real difficulty. But it was classic, terrorist action, really. A similar thing's happening right now, of course, that happened in Iraq, and it's kind of happening in Afghanistan as a result of all that, and the borders of Pakistan. 10 years ago nearly now, there was some people spent a couple of £100,000 on some flying lessons, flew some planes into buildings, or blew up tubes in London, or blew up a couple of nightclubs around the world. And all of the invisible power structures, the invisible investments that were made by largely Western powers in non-Western nations, which people have been complaining about for a long time, and which had been up to that point largely invisible, suddenly became visible. Suddenly, there was internment without trial and human rights abuses in Abu Ghraib and other places that came out as a result of that. Suddenly there were checkpoints, suddenly there were helicopters circling over your city, machine gunning down groups of civilians. And that's exactly, of course, if you're thinking and using terrorist theory, that's exactly what you would want. You would carry out an action which provokes a response, and that response reveals power structures that were up to that point invisible. Oh God, that's taken a long time to explain. So what's poetic terrorism? Poetic terrorism is exactly the same or works in the same way, but you don't fly anything to a building, you don't blow anybody up. You carry out some kind of an action which is designed to provoke a response, and the response reveals the power structures that were up to that point invisible, because they were just part of culture, they were just part of the stuff that surrounds you, the wallpaper, the water that fish swim in. It's just part of the air that you breathe. You don't realise that you're part of the hegemony, as it's sometimes called, until something something happens to reveal it to you. And that's what poetic terrorism is about. It's about those kind of actions, little actions which reveal things to you. I'm trying to think of a good example, actually. I'm trying to think of an example from feminism, actually, because I've been making a couple of videos recently about feminisms of different kinds, and there have been some great actions. There's a great company called the Guerrilla Girls, which is an anonymous group of female artists, largely based in New York, and which my wife was tangentially involved with for a while in the 80s. And they've done a whole series of actions, holding press conferences, making objects and making sculptures and posters and billboard campaigns, all of which are really little subtle reminders about the hidden power structures. So they did a great series of posters where it talked about, there was 2 statistics. One was the number of female artists that were represented in the Museum of Modern Art, and the next statistic was the number of pictures of naked women that there were in the Museum of Modern Art. And just putting those statistics up side by side, well, it kind of provokes a response. The MoMA had to come out and make some kind of statement about this, had to take it on board, and suddenly the debate happens, and the thing that was previously invisible becomes visible because of this little act of provocation that's been made. Cindy Sherman, another great artist, photographer, she did something similar. For some reason she was commissioned, and I don't know how she managed it, she was commissioned to do a series of Centrefolds for Playboy, which is really outside of her thing. She does autobiographical photographs of herself in different guises. But she did a series of Centrefolds, alright, but the Centrefolds she produced were really kind of damaged. They looked like women who'd been raped or abused, but they were in these poses of Centrefolds. Playboy pulled out, they refused to publish them. But, which is great, it's exactly the response you want. You know, okay, you want a Centrefold, this is what a Centrefold looks like. Publish this, you fucker. And of course they didn't, and then there's a whole debate about why not publish those. Why publish the ones that look as if they're enjoying themselves? You know, why publish these airbrushed ones as opposed to these airbrushed ones? Great stuff, great stuff. Anyhow, I'm probably over the 10 minutes, so that's Poetic Terrorism.